Hello, my name is Kirk, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about how capitalism creates identity. Um, so, as always, I want to start with what that means. By capitalism, I am talking about white supremacist, capitalist, cis hetero patriarchy. And yeah, that is a mouthful to say. So I'm not going to be saying that every time, but those things, capitalist, white supremacist, capitalist, cis heteropatriarchy, are all inextricably linked. They are all deeply, deeply connected to each other. They interlace and have grown together to oppress us all, and they're all deeply connected. But I'm going to be talking about capitalism, and I'll say white supremacy, or I'll identify what I'm specifically talking about at the time. But what does it mean? What does it mean when I say how capitalism creates identity? How does capitalism create identity? Well, to talk about this, I want to say that there are basically three levels of identity that we can discuss in this conversation, and capitalism only tells us about two of these identities. So I'm going to go through those first, and we can get into it. The first level of identity, and this is the first thing capitalism tells us, the first thing it wants us to know about ourselves and about the world, is that we are individuals, that we are islands, that we are alone. Capitalism wants us to believe that every single thing that happens to us in our life, good or bad, is the result of what we do as individuals. That morally we are responsible for our successes and failures, that we are not connected to a lineage, a history in any way. We are individuals. This is what capitalism tells us. This is what it wants us to believe. However, it becomes increasingly obvious the more that you live in the world that we're not just individuals, that we have connections with other people, that there are good and bad reasons, or good and bad aspects to living that connect us with other people. And so capitalism then unwillingly gives in and tells us, okay, we're not just individuals. It tells us that we have shared identities. It tells us that we are white, we are black, we are men, we are women, we are cis, we are trans, whatever. But capitalism tells us that we have these identities. It allows us these identities, these shared identities with other people. But the thing is, all of these identities were created by capitalism, and they were created by capitalism to divide us and to conquer us. Divide and conquer is like the most common tactic used by oppressors anywhere. Divide and conquer. Make sure that the people who really are united in their goals are not able to work together, and they did this very, very historically. We know that that capitalism has divided us along lines of race, along lines of gender. But what I'm also saying is that these identities are made up entirely. That they are not rooted in any kind of real material conditions of reality. And to talk about that, I want to ask, who is considered black in America? Who is considered black? And it's not about skin tone. It's not necessarily about skin tone, right? There are light-skinned people, there are dark-skinned people. It's actually still, in America, the way that blackness is considered to exist is still based on the really, really archaic white supremacist rule of one drop of black blood, one drop of African blood makes you black. And we can see how that is sort of like insane in some ways, and it's very obviously white supremacist. It's very much like a method of control, a method of distancing black people from whiteness, from the benefits of whiteness, by categorically saying that anyone with a single drop of black blood is black. It creates this artificial race. It creates this identity, which is of course not to say that blackness doesn't exist. Of course it does. and we'll get to like the contradictions of race in a second, the contradictions of how capitalism manufactured race and its reality. But I also want to talk about this idea of blood. This idea of blood, which is still how we consider everything about genealogy, everything about who is what race is considered in blood. And to talk about that, I want to talk about Indigenous people, Native people. The same rules apply under the white supremacist American hegemony. Native ancestry is considered in blood quanta, which is like, are you half Cherokee? Are you 1/4 Cherokee? It's all of these sort of like weird, arbitrary, like obviously white supremacist divisions of blood that have nothing to do with how Indigenous people actually figured their own ancestry. It has nothing to do with that. It is totally a white supremacist invention and fabrication and overlay on top of that. And in that same way that we see that the way that we talk about race and identity are fabricated under capitalism, whiteness is as well. Whiteness is also a fabrication of white supremacist capitalism, manufactured in order to empower some people and disempower others, manufactured actually in order to stoke racial violence, to stoke racial separation along racial lines, so that people cannot unite together. And so what we maybe have heard the history, or maybe have heard white supremacists talk about this before, but that when Irish people and when Italian people came to America, they were discriminated against. They were not considered white. We maybe heard this before. And although the claims that white supremacists will make are completely false, it's very, 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 very different the way that Irish people were treated and the way that Italian people were treated versus the way that black people were and are treated. It is very different to be enslaved versus to be discriminated against based on your religion or whatever. But the truth of the matter is that they weren't really considered white. They weren't white according to the standards of the day. By our standards, they are white, but the meaning of the word white and the meaning of who gets to be white, who is allowed to be white, has changed drastically over the years, and it has changed in accordance with the maintenance of power of the ruling class. That is not to be forgotten, is that whiteness and blackness are constructed, both of them, to maintain the power of the ruling class. And so when I said earlier that that race is literally fabricated, literally invented by white supremacy, it is. Every single time we talk about race, we're really using the language of European white supremacist racial scientists who were eugenicists, who used measurements of the skull to determine superiority, and that is where all of our language about race has come from. But at the same time, race does exist. Race does exist because it acts in the world. It has an impact in the world. Black people have a significantly different experience in America than white people do, by far. And so we see that the illusion that capitalism has made out of our lives, out of race, is complicated. We have to hold these contradictions inside our heads. We have to know that race is real because it affects people. We have to also understand that race is a deliberate system of control that capitalism uses to divide us, to frequently divide us. Another good example of this is, if you know the history of the feminist movement in America, the feminist movement actually arose out of the abolition movement, the movement to abolish slavery. These women saw in the conditions of slavery a similar but not the same type of subjugation that they were experiencing. They saw that Black people were being subjugated, and they saw that they were also being subjugated. And these women joined the abolition movement, invigorated it, and eventually the feminist movement rose out of that. And what happened actually is this sort of tactic of divide and conquer, which the capitalists, the white supremacists of the day, basically impressed this idea onto them that only one of them, only one group, only either black people or women could receive rights. Who was going to get through the door first is basically what they told them, and that fractured the movement. That led the white women feminists to break off from the abolition movement and to begin fighting only for themselves. And so we can see there that that is the tactic that white supremacy uses. That's the tactic that capitalism uses over and over again. And we inadvertently reinforce it when we do not recognize that it is a source of division. It is a tool of capitalist control. How else do they control us, right? How else are we controlled by our shared identities, by not only by our race but our gender and sexuality? Well, we are controlled by the media. Where do we learn? Where do we learn that these identities exist in the first place? We learn in the media. We are told who we're allowed to be, taught how we are allowed to be by the media, by movies, by television, and we're also controlled in a really interesting way now. Not interesting in certain senses, but in a violent way, actually. We are being allowed to have greater representation on TV and in movies, and we get to see women, like real women characters, and like trans people on TV and stuff like that. And that's all really well and good, and it's great, but it also means that they're dictating to us what our experience is. They're dictating to us our stories. They're telling us who and how we are. Because we will never be able to tell our stories truly via these capitalist media, because everything will always have to go through that filter. And if it's anti-capitalist, which it may be, or if it threatens capitalism, which it does, it will not be allowed to be told. Our story, like there is like an especially radical anti-capitalist idea contained just within the idea of being trans. This idea that all of these boundaries that they set for us, that men are men and women are women, are not as strict as we're taught that they are. That they're not natural. That they're not inherent. So these ideas are inherently anti-capitalist, anti-white supremacist, and those ideas are being very carefully integrated into capitalism right now as we speak. So that is sort of what we're seeing now. That is what we're seeing, the media sort of incorporating our identities into its body, into what is acceptable under capitalism, and defining for us what we feel like is acceptable. And another aspect of this is that these boxes that we're given, because that's what they are, man, woman, black, white, cis, trans, these are all boxes. These are all basically, they're not identities as such. They have become these methods of containment, but because under capitalism, those kinds of labels, those kinds of identities have really, really strict boundaries. They're not allowed to be violated. They're not. They're just not, because that would threaten hierarchy. Hierarchy is threatened by fluidity. Hierarchy is solid. Hierarchy is strict. Hierarchy is threatened by fluidity. And so when we engage in fluidity, when we overwrite these boxes, when we expand ourselves, that threatens capitalism. And we also should be aware that these boxes, these identities like cis, trans, man, woman, and racial identity were not necessarily present in other societies, in non-white supremacist societies, in societies that existed pre-colonization, pre-white supremacist colonization. There are societies that have multiple genders, like more than two or three. There are societies where race or a racial identity or ethnicity was constructed in a completely different way, and we don't really have access to that now because all we really have access to are these boxes. And the another method of control that this entails, that this sort of what we're allowed to have under capitalism as our identities, is we are forced to buy back into the system to have it at all. Queer people especially do need to identify, to be able to express and identify their queerness. And the only ways that we're able to do that is through capitalistic means and through a capitalistic lens, and literally buying products and watching TV, watching movies, which is another kind of consumption, which is another kind of buying, that contain queer narratives, queer stories that are, again, stamped by capitalism, that are intrinsically not harmful to capitalism in some way or other. And so we need to, in order to survive, we need to have that identity. We need to have some sort of identity. But the identities that we have, by and large, in front of us are manufactured and maintained by capitalism. And because of that, they are inherently divisive. Okay, so at the beginning I said that there are 3 levels in this conversation of identity. And so we went through individualism. We are all individuals. The contradiction there is, yes, we are an individual, but also, as we are not just an individual. And we sort of like the we are just an individual is the lie that capitalism tells us. But the truth is that we are an individual, and so there's a conflict there. The second level of identity is our shared identities like race, gender, sexuality, etc. These are also manufactured. We get told this idea of what it means to be a certain race, what it means to be a certain gender, etc. And that too contains sort of a contradiction, a lie. It's like, yes, they are real because there are real side effects, like women get treated differently than men. That's the reality. But it's not an intrinsic reality. It's a reality under capitalism that has been manufactured by capitalism to control us. Creating hierarchies, a racial hierarchy, a gendered hierarchy, a sexuality-based hierarchy. These are tools of control, and all those identities, the identities that we are allowed to have, that we're allowed to see, are tools of control. They're made up, but they exist. So it's another contradiction in terms of the shared identity. The third identity is class. And what is class? It's not just economic class. Although the economic component is extremely important. I'm not sure if you notice in the other two sort of levels of identity, there is no mention of economics, and capitalism doesn't give us a mention of economics. There is no component, even though it shapes our lives so completely, whether we are wealthy or poor. It's not a factor. It's not a part of our individual identity or our shared identities. So the economic component is a really important component of class, but it's not just that. Again, class is an identity that is inherently rooted in our material conditions. Class is an identity that is inherently rooted in our material conditions. Unlike the other identities, which sort of have this sort Ouroboros, snake eating itself problem, where they've been created by capitalism and they exist and they're creating themselves over and over and over again. Class doesn't have that problem. Class doesn't have any contradictions because capitalism doesn't want us to think about class. Capitalism doesn't want us to learn about class. Capitalism doesn't want us to look at class at all. Class is inherently rooted in our material conditions, and that does mean that it has an economic aspect to it. But it also has racial aspects, it has gendered aspects. Class is about all of the things that determine your relationship to power in the world. And looked at that way, it seems like class could almost be anything. Like class could be as big as you want it to be. Like there are as many classes as there are people, and you can look at it that way if you want. You can. It's like certainly a truth. It's a truth that is not necessarily useful, but it is a truth that is antagonistic to capitalism because we live in a world of spectrums, not binaries. And I would also add here that we don't have to be prescriptive about class. We don't have to just take dogmatically what class means from a book. It's great to read. I highly recommend reading Marx, reading Lenin. They have great ideas, but they are not alive right now. And what I insist that we do, what I insist that all of us do is look at the world with our own two eyes and see for ourselves what the reality is. Look honestly and look at the material conditions, and your vision will be informed by the things that you read. Your vision will be informed by the ideas that you know of, but we can't just accept definitions that are handed down from the past. We have to make these definitions from ourselves. And the way that I find really useful to think about class, and that's something I think we should talk about too, is that we need to be working in ways that are useful for us, that are pragmatic, that help us engender revolution, for lack of a better word. The way that is really useful for me to think about class is breaking it down into a binary, reducing it to an incredibly simple form, in which there are two classes basically, and there's one class that is people who have to work to survive, people who need to work for a living in order to meet all of their necessities of life. And then the other class is people who don't need to work, people who don't need to work to survive. And when you look at it that way, when you break down the entire human race into those two groups, it becomes really obvious who and what our enemies are. Our enemies are the people who have hoarded all of this wealth. These people who don't have to work, why don't they have to work? They don't have to work because they have inherited wealth. They have inherited wealth that is based on exploitation, or they have exploited others to a staggering degree in which they have stolen all our wealth from us. The wealth of the world belongs to the people. We are the ones who create it. The laborers, the workers, we are the ones who are creating all of the wealth of the world. We make the world run. We do everything. We harvest the food. We build the homes. We make society function. We enable each other to live. And the ruling class, the people who don't need to work, do nothing other than own us, really. They own our labor, they own our homes, they own all of the means of production, to use the Marxist term. And it is really clear when you look at it that way that the struggle for black liberation, the struggle for women's liberation, the struggle for queer liberation are all facets of the struggle for the liberation of the working class. And each of them has their own, of course, needs and drives and goals, and that's great. That, of course they do, because the material conditions of all of those people are very different from each other. So that's normal, that kind of makes sense. But they are really strongly united in the idea that we are all working class, that we are trying to liberate the working class. And you can see really clearly, this goes back to sort of the problem of representation, which is like representation isn't enough. Representation is great, and it's good to see yourself on TV, and it's good to see people who look like you in the media, but that makes us believe sometimes, that makes some people believe that that's all that matters. And it's sort of like a surface level solution. It's like a figurehead. And like the same is true if we look at people like Kamala Harris or Barack Obama. They are not of the working class necessarily. I mean, they work, but you know what I mean. You know, they're actually their class allies are the ruling class. They serve the ruling class. They do not serve the working class. And so just having people of color in positions of power, having gay people in positions of power. It's like I saw like, what is it? The CEO of Raytheon is gay. It's like, wow, cool. The guy who sells like billions of dollars worth of military equipment to the United States government is gay. Great. That doesn't help anyone. That doesn't change anything. That doesn't stop imperialism from happening. So it's really important to know that our shared identities, our racial and gender identities, matter less in some ways than our class identity. I and I'm going to expand on that because that's I think a sort of volatile thing to say. And before I do, I want to say like I want to ask you to please hold a contradiction for me. This is just a personal request. So when I see, there are times when I see people say that class is primary, and I don't agree with those people. But I also do believe that class is primary. So sometimes when people say that, they are erasing the need for an awareness of politics that serves to alleviate problems based on racial identity or gender identity. And I don't feel that way at all. Black Lives Matter is a necessary and important movement because they face different threats than other races, especially of police violence and incarceration. We do need to be allying ourselves with movements like Black Lives Matter because, we are a part of them. Whew, okay, sorry, I gotta shake that off. I got like a weird vibe for a second. What I'm trying to say is that class being primary does not invalidate the struggles for racial justice or gender justice. Class being primary actually integrates the contradictions of race and gender. Class being primary means that the people who share class characteristics are united in a struggle against whatever it is that creates those class characteristics. Because often class characteristics are created by imperial violence and created by white supremacist or capitalist violence. A good example of this is the land back movement, the movement to return land to Indigenous people, which of course we are living on stolen land. The United States of America, like all of it is stolen. Every colony in the world is stolen. We are living in a settler colony, and the land needs to be given back. But the Indigenous people who are still living, the indigenous cultures who are still living in the United States and thriving in the United States, and are subject to the United States laws illegally, they're very diverse. It's not just one group of people. It's not just one culture, one group of indigenous people. It is a diverse group of people who are united by the class characteristic of having their land stolen by the United States government. And so they form a class which can then fight for the return of stolen land. And they become a class, even if we agree with their aims and their goals, which we do absolutely. Their class character, I don't share their class characteristic. I have not had land stolen from me. In fact, I am a member of the white race which has stolen the land via the United States government as its legalizing authority. So you can look at it. You can look at it that way. That class creates. That class is what creates the unity around issues of reparations, of issues of justice. Is the class is what makes those groups whole, because that no, not because that's the way, that's how it is. That class is what does that, and because that's true, because class is primary, in that sense, in the sense of it envelops and becomes the foundation on which we can unite all of our struggles. It makes solidarity with each other imperative. It makes it undeniable. We Wow, I'm like very absent-minded today. So that's sort of what I wanted to get at today in this, is that these identities which we are allowed under capitalism are tools of control which are used against us, used to deceive us, and used to make us believe that we can only fight for ourselves in one way or another. But the understanding of class, understanding that class means, class literally is what unites us based on our material conditions. That understanding shows us that solidarity is essential, that solidarity is only like natural, to use an inappropriate word. We are in this together. It's so undeniable to me that I sort of like have a hard time wrapping my head around it. It's like we are, all of our struggles are united. All of our struggles are interrelated. We can only become free by destroying our enemy that divides us. We are never going to be free if we try to piecemeal recover our liberties from capitalism, from white supremacy, one by one at a time. We let some people have this, we let other people have that. We're slowly raising the bar on racial discrimination. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter what the capitalists allow us. We can't find justice based on what capitalism will or will not allow us to have. We can only get justice by working together, by understanding that we have this shared class relationship, that we are already united. It's really just about unlearning the rules of capitalism. It's about unlearning what we have been taught to believe about ourselves, that we have inherent differences, that we are alone, that we are isolated, that we are individuals. It's like, at the end of the day, we are not. We are, by the virtue of our exploitation, by the virtue of the violence that is constantly being done to us, all of us, by capitalism, by white supremacy, we are of a class. We are exploited. We are all exploited. And being able to see that, being able to understand that, and especially I think really clearly as people who need to, understanding a class, like a two-part class triangle, as people who need to work and people who don't need to work, is a really, really clear division. And it's why capitalism will never talk about class to us. They do not want to raise class consciousness, because if we raise class consciousness, we will immediately understand and know that we are united in our struggle. against capitalism. We will immediately see our enemy. We will immediately see our allies. We will immediately recognize each other as family, because we are united in this struggle to overcome white supremacist, capitalist, cis hetero patriarchy. All of those pieces must fall together, or they won't fall at all. That's really the truth of it, is that we have to understand. And why I wanted to do this today is because I think a big part of overcoming capitalism is overcoming the capitalist inside ourselves, overcoming the ideas that capitalism has foisted onto us, like this idea that we are separate, like this idea that race is an inherent aspect of our reality, rather than something that has been put onto us, rather than something that has been given to us as a means of creating a racial hierarchy, which is why I really like the use of the of racialized instead of like racialized people. People are racialized. And in general, using verbs I find to be much more useful than giving someone a label, giving someone a noun, just because it implies an actor, it implies an action. And when people are racialized, you have to ask who is racializing them. It's white supremacist, capitalist, cis heteropatriarchy that's racializing them. And yeah, in general, I think it's a really good. Alex, I see your comment, and I don't know. I honestly don't know enough about the critique of Marx being a class reductionist to note that. I think that there may be some validity to that. Like, if we're talking, this is the sort of the reason why I invite people to see for themselves and decide for themselves. Like, read all you want, read everything, and then look at the world and decide for yourself. Because Marx was he was living 150 years ago in Europe. He was white. He's going to have different ideas than we have now. He's going to have a different understanding of the world. And even, obviously, his work is monumental. There's no denying that Marxism has given us all the hope, the great hope of the world is socialism, right? And but yeah, I don't know enough to comment on that, honestly. But I do want to again urge us all and remind myself to not think about things as static, to not let ourselves be convinced that what has always been and will always be. Things exist because of the way they interact with the world. And so earlier when I was talking about race, I think this pertains to gender as well, but I think race illustrates it in a very strong way. Race, when I said earlier that race does not exist, and it doesn't, because race is this idea that human beings came up with to categorize other human beings in order to subjugate them. So race is inherently a tool of white supremacy. But race exists because of the effects that the idea of race has on the world. Race does things. It doesn't just sit there. It's not just some benign object. It is an actor. Race creates problems. Race creates violence based on the ideas of race that are promulgated amongst the people. And that is true of just about everything, is that there's nothing in this world that just is. Everything does. To exist, it must do something. It has an effect, it has an impact. And so that's why we can hold this idea in our head that race is not real, race was made up as a system of control, and we can also hold the idea in our head that race is real because it has an effect, because it does something. But we shouldn't. There on one of those objects is defining race as an object, Race as a noun, race as an object doesn't exist. Race as an action, race as a thing that does things in the world does exist. And that's really true of everything. And looking at it that way, understanding it that way, understanding that we are made and being constantly made by things that are constantly going on in the world, that the world makes itself. The world is always making itself, and we are making the world, and the ideas we have and the ideas we share are making the world constantly. Nothing exists as a static object. Everything either does or it does not. And that is how these contradictions can really be resolved. That we are individuals, but we're not alone. We are only individuals so much as we experience the world through the lens of a single body. But the reality which is invisible and active is that we are not really individuals. We are members of a society, we are members of a community, we are members of a constructed, animated race. And we can by seeing these things this way, I think that we can also overcome the hold that capitalism has over us through them, right? Because these ideas, this like the idea, and like let's I've been talking about race a lot. I'm gonna switch to gender. The idea of womanhood is especially constructed, and we like people talk about this. I've seen people talk about this. I've read about this. That like maleness is neutral, right? And femaleness is gendered. And what that means changes all the time. It changes all the time. What does it mean to be a woman changes all the time. And that meaning, that collectively constructed meaning, has an impact on people's lives. But it's not static. We are taught to treat these ideas as if they are static, as if and you know how we're taught to treat these ideas as if they're static is through media. We're taught to see the future and the past as static, as these ideas will be static. Here's a small anecdote to prove my point. I was watching Star Trek recently. I'm a big fan of Star Trek. I was watching TNG, The Next Generation, and there is like this really funny like back and forth dialogue that happens where it's just like they're talking about aliens, like a completely alien race. They're not human, not humanoid, and just like very different, and how different they are. And then one person says, it's like, oh yeah, but the men and women of their society are, it's just like, oh, so it's like these people are so completely different from humans. They're like not like humans at all, but they're also just like men and women, and they follow along male and female stereotypes. It's kind of ridiculous to think of that, but that is a way that, not that specifically, but that's one of the ways that gender especially is constructed to be this immaculate object, this thing where it is and has always been, in Star Trek, which conceivably is like hundreds of years in the future, men and women still treat each other the same, and women are expected to do certain things, and men are expected to do certain things, and it's very much like a construction of our society, and it says this is just how things are. And if you look at period pieces or pieces that are set in the past, it's the same kind of thing. We don't see truly historically accurate representations of the way that men and women were at the time, because we don't really have a good understanding of that beyond in a spiritual sense. There's like an essential, like we can have a historical record of how men and women were treated at the time, and we know that throughout much of male history, women have been subjugated differently in all societies, and they hold different roles in all societies. But something that is unilaterally true is that the condition of women has actually deteriorated in the last couple hundred years. women's work, the work that women had to do to maintain a house, the division of labor between men and women actually empowered women in certain ways to have authority, to have power. The work that they did was meaningful to society. Society could not run without their labor. This was stripped away. This was stripped away from women, and that's when we sort of start seeing the increased subjugation of women, the increased idea that to be a woman is to be feminine, whatever feminine means. To be a woman is to be delicate, to be demure. All of these ideas begin to be put onto women, and those ideas are still basically what make up what we consider to be womanhood and women today. And those ideas are the continuity of those ideas is represented by media representations of the past, the future, and the present, all with women acting like women, whatever that means. And that is a really dangerous tool that we have. And we didn't always used to be able to do this. We didn't always used to be able to create these kind of representations of in a way that is so visceral. Like TV and movies, because they have the component of sight, have this atemporality about them, that they become infinite, and by being infinite they become archetypal. They show us how things are. It's almost like we're gazing into the realm of the gods when we watch TV or when we watch movies. It's like we're looking at people in their idealized form, the idealized society, the idealized woman. We get shown that a lot, and that becomes sort of our reference point for how we see women and how women are treated. But the reality is that there's really no such thing as a woman, except for the activity of being a woman. And this I want to bring us back to the difference between nouns and verbs. And you can be a woman. You can do womanly things. You can act in a womanly way. You can whatever that means. You can do it because we as a society have ideas about what it means to be a woman. But there is no woman noun. There is no static object that is a woman without activity. You have to do things to be them, and that is another way that if we look at it that way, if we uncouple our mentalities from this idea that things exist in this static form, we can see that they really don't. And this kind of idea about things existing as a static form, as nature intended them, as God intended them. God made the world exactly as it is 6,000 years ago. These are the ideas that inform white supremacist, capitalist, cis heteropatriarchy. And these are the ideas that must be overthrown inside ourselves and out in the world. Like the only way to overthrow an idea is inside yourself, right? Spiritual first, the mental, the self first, and then proceed outward. Okay. So that those ideas, the ideas of the static object that exists forever, the platonic woman, the platonic white person, these all are, the idea that anything can exist that way is critical to any system of hierarchy, to any system of subjugation, because everything rests on that. It's if a woman isn't necessarily a woman, then what is her place in the gender hierarchy? If whiteness isn't really an intrinsic quality, then where do all of these different people fit on the racial hierarchy? And so you can see something that I was saying earlier, which is that trans people, by their very nature, are anti-capitalist, anti-white supremacist, anti-hierarchy, because the inherent fluidity of our identity, the way that we have transgressed what we have been told is natural, is in complete opposition to white supremacist, capitalist, cis heteropatriarchy. I said I wasn't going to say it, and I'm saying it, and you know what? I couldn't be happier. But yeah, and that's I think that's part of what is really liberating about being trans, about seeing yourself as trans, is that you are able to, through direct evidence, we have direct evidence that things are not static, that things are not, that objects, that ideas are not inherent to the world, that they become, that they do things, that they move. We are proof of that, and we get to be the proof for ourselves, and to a lesser extent for others, because it's not important for others to use us in that way. But we are proof positive that hierarchy is flawed, that the system of believing in ideas that never change, that this is the way things are, this is the way things always have been, that's just false. We completely prove it false. And another thing that is really liberatory inside of transness is the knowledge that it's not binary, that being non-binary, that being trans is inherently something that doesn't have to be A or B. It has this gradient, it has this expansive quality to it that shows us that, again, that the box isn't important, that the box is meaningless, that words are only useful up to the point where they get close enough to describing the phenomenon that we're talking about, but they cease being useful when they stop being true. And with the boxes that are given us in capitalist society, our identities, whether racial or gendered or sexual, those boxes are never going to fit. They're never going to fit. They're never going to fit us. We cannot be defined by those boxes, and that's like another one of the contradictions that capitalism doesn't want you to see, is that every single person in the world does not fit the ideal version of whatever their identity is. Cis men, go out of their minds trying to live up to whatever they think being a man is. We see it all the time, and they take it out on the rest of us because they can. They take it out on everyone else in the world because they can. And the same is true for white people. And it's not like I'm not guilty of this either. I'm not saying I'm like a perfect white person at all. I'm saying that every single white person, including me, is guilty of expressing their whiteness in a violent way against non-white people. And that's something that we all have to try hard to avoid. And the same thing is true of men. Men don't have to, knowing that you don't have to live up to being a man, because that means nothing, is the most freeing thing in the world. I highly recommend it. Cis men, you don't have to be a man. Just forget about it. Forget what it means. Just be your fucking self. And the same thing is true, like, of course, of race as well. It's like, I don't align myself with the goals of whiteness. The goals of whiteness are white supremacy. The goals of whiteness are violence against non-whites. And my goal is to dismantle whiteness, to destroy the power structure that enables whiteness to exist in the first place. The power structure that uses whiteness as a tool to commit acts of violence all over the world, to commit acts of imperialism, of aggression, that don't even serve me, except in the most oblique way of privilege. And of course I do acknowledge my privilege. I didn't mean to start talking about me here, but here we go. I do acknowledge my privilege, and I do acknowledge that I have benefited greatly from being white, because every white person benefits greatly from being white. But I do not condone or align myself with the goals of whiteness at large. And the goals of whiteness at large, again, are benefiting capitalists, primarily capitalists. And I guess since we brought this up, the reason that whiteness was created in the first place, the reason that people made whiteness, that capitalists, white supremacists built whiteness, was to give poor whites a reason not to ally themselves with poor non-whites. So whiteness itself is really just a fabrication in order to prevent class consciousness. And it's good to see it that way, and it's good to know that. I think that the worst thing that a white person can do is fill themselves with white guilt, is to be so sorry that I'm white. Oh no, like I don't know what I'm doing, like please help me. It's like, no, that's not what we should do. What we should do is recognize and understand our position, our privilege as white people, the way that we have personally enacted violence onto others, take responsibility for it, make amends, and use every power that you have at your disposal to destroy whiteness, to absolutely destroy whiteness. And one of the tools that we have to do that is recognizing our own class consciousness, recognizing that we aren't separate from each other, that we have so much in common, that we have a common enemy. And of course this isn't true of everyone. There might be a billionaire watching this, there might be capitalists watching this, I don't know. Who knows what my audience is? Is it half capitalist, half anti-capitalist? Probably not. But you know what I mean, is that it's not all of us. I'm not talking to every single person in the world right now when I say that we are all one big happy family. I'm talking to the workers. I'm talking to the people who have to work for a living. I'm talking to the people who scrape by to survive so that wealthy people can live in incredibly decadent luxury. I'm talking to my Kasamas. I love you all, and we are gonna win. We can do this, and as long as we look at the world clearly, as long as we see the world for what it is, see the world for what we are going to succeed. We are going to overcome this sort of capitalist hegemony, and a big part of that is recognizing that that we share a struggle. We all share a struggle. We all share a struggle for liberation together. And if we can see that, if we can overcome that sort of capitalist delusion that we are just our race, we are just our gender, we are just individuals, if we can see that as the tactic that it is trying to divide us, we can come together, and we can come together as people who just by being human have a love of freedom, have a love of justice, that we can see that love in each other, that we can unite on that love and become powerful. We can take our power back, because the power is ours. We are the people who decide what that power is, what the power of the world is. The people who are in power right now wouldn't stand a chance if we all were able to unite with each other, to join our struggles together. We can see that. We can see that every time we stand up, every time people rise up against the powerful, they are afraid. They are afraid of us. They are terrified that we are going to come and we are going to take our power back, and they are going to lose everything. And they should be afraid. They should be afraid, because I have to tell you, capitalism is failing. Capitalism is dying. Capitalism is basically dead, but sometimes it takes a while for such a giant, awful corpse to realize it's dead. So while it's hulking forward, we are building power. While it's still powerful enough to surveil and crush us, we can build our power. We can join together, and we can build a movement that will create a better world out of the husk of capitalism. That's all I got for today. Got a little riled up there, huh? Hell yeah, anarchy in the USA, anarchy, communism, we're allies. We're all anti-capitalists. So that's what really matters. Okay, it is just about 2, but I can chill for a little bit. Does anyone have any questions? Does anyone want to talk about? Is there anything that just this made you think of, or do you want to say anything random? I'm just here. I'm just here to entertain. What up, Vico? What up, Marcel? Leftists unite. We have everything in common. We have everything in common. We can figure out how to run the world after capitalism is destroyed. Okay. um, okay. What do you think of gender and race abolition? That's an interesting question. I think that that's something that is uh, there isn't one decree that I could give for that. I think that that's more of like a personal matter in a sense. I gender gender abolition is a that's an interesting prospect because a lot of people, myself included, find happiness and joy in ascribing to a certain gender. I'm non-binary. I love being non-binary. That's just a word that people made up, but I feel happy about it. I don't think we need to jump into the idea of gender abolition. I think that as long as it serves us, we can, as long as we are riding the horse and the horse isn't riding us, so to speak, we can live with the ways that we have gender right now because these are just the tools we have. Like English is an imperfect language, but it's what we have to communicate with each other, so we have to use it. So I think that I kind of feel the same way about gender, where it's just like if someone wants to be a gender abolitionist, more power to them. I hope they are really happy with that. Do it. No, I'm not going to tell everybody in the world to do that. We don't have to. And I guess kind of the same thing for race abolition, but it's a little bit more difficult especially because you like race is different than gender, right? It's not. It's very much a different beast. And yes, race, the way that we understand it, like I was saying, is um, it's it's manufactured, but it really does exist. And I think that we have to I think we have to, before we can abolish race, which maybe could be like an idea that's hundreds of years down the line, honestly, I think that we have to abolish the conditions, our enemies who have created race in the first place. We have to destroy, um, you know, white supremacist, capitalist, cis, heteropatriarchy, and then we can sort of like understand and like condition ourselves. It's like there have always been cultures and ethnicities, people who like grouped together and shared things, and those used to be somewhat fluid boundaries. Race is not a fluid boundary, and so I think that we don't have to decide right now what a future possibility of racial identity after capitalism would look like. We can just sort of um, destroy capitalism and then let whatever people want to do, let that be our guiding light. Good question. I appreciate you asking that. All right. Well, this was a whole lot of fun, as always. Thank you for joining. I hope you got something out of it. I know I did. Really, really thank you all for coming, and love yourself. Take care of yourself. Be good.